This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by folklore, superstitions, and imagined events. While it references the Missouri Ozarks in the year 1834 and uses historical details to create atmosphere, the characters, events, and supernatural elements are fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The intent is to entertain, not to claim historical accuracy. Prudence Hoffman arrived in the Ozarks with little more than a wagon, a pair of oxen, and the remnants of a life that had already been marked by hardship. She was not a young woman, but neither was she old, somewhere in her mid-30s, though her weathered hands and weary eyes made her appear older. She wore the black bonnet and plain dress of a widow, for her husband had died of fever along the trail. Some whispered that she had buried him in a shallow grave by the roadside, though others said she had burned his body in the forest, muttering words no good Christian would ever say. The truth was lost, and in a land where rumor moved faster than truth, suspicion took root before she had even set foot among the settlers. Prudence was not like the other women, where they spoke softly and deferred to the authority of their husbands or preachers. Prudence carried herself with an independence that unsettled people. She knew plants. Every leaf, root, and stem seemed to reveal its secrets to her. She brewed teas that eased fevers, poultices that soothed burns, and tinctures that stopped bleeding when knives slipped or axes bit too deep. Her skills saved lives, and at first, people welcomed her. But the line between healer and witch was a thin one, and in a place where faith was the only armor against fear, her knowledge was a dangerous kind of power. Children whispered about her before they dared approach her door. They said her house, a lonely cabin on the edge of the woods, smelled of strange herbs that curled smoke into the trees. Some swore they saw her walking in the forest at night, carrying a lantern that glowed red instead of gold. One boy claimed he saw her talking to a wolf as though it were her companion, and though the boy's father beat him for lying, the story spread nonetheless. By the time she had lived in the Ozarks a year, Prudence Hoffman's name was spoken with a mixture of respect and unease. Still, for a time, she was tolerated. Settlers came to her when they had no other choice. A woman who had lost 3 infants in childbirth turned to Prudence for help when her belly grew round again, and the child she bore with Prudence's aid survived. Another man, poisoned by spoiled meat, was pulled back from the brink of death after Prudence forced down a bitter draught of her own making. In those moments, she was seen as a blessing. Yet for every success, there was a failure, and failures left shadows on her name. When a fevered child died despite her efforts, the family whispered that she had not tried to save him at all. When a cow miscarried after being fed herbs she had prescribed, the farmer muttered curses under his breath. Every misfortune became a question mark that hung over her head. It did not help that Prudence rarely attended church. The preacher spoke fire and brimstone from the pulpit each Sunday, condemning sin and warning of Satan's works among them. But Prudence was often absent. She claimed she was too busy tending to her herbs or caring for the sick, but in truth, she did not believe as the others did. Her faith was in the natural world, in the earth's bounty and the mysteries of life and death she had studied since childhood. To her neighbors, this was evidence enough that her soul was astray. A woman who turns from the Lord, the preacher said more than once, walks hand in hand with the devil. Though he never named her outright, the people understood his meaning. The unease deepened when strange events began to unfold around her. Livestock fell ill without explanation, leaving carcasses bloated in the fields. A series of storms struck the valley with unusual ferocity, uprooting cabins and flooding crops. Children were struck by night terrors, waking screaming of a woman in black standing at their bedsides. None of these events could be proven to have anything to do with Prudence Hoffman, yet her name was whispered after each one. It was as though the land itself conspired to set her apart, to make her the vessel of the people's fear. Prudence, for her part, seemed untouched by their suspicion. She lived alone, growing her herbs, keeping her small home tidy, and offering help when asked. Some claimed she spoke to herself when she thought no one was listening. Others insisted they saw her walking in the rain without becoming wet, as though the storm bent around her. Perhaps these were inventions of frightened minds, or perhaps they were truths too strange to dismiss. Whatever the case, every new story strengthened the shadow around her. Her presence stirred division in the community. Some defended her fiercely, pointing to the lives she had saved. They argued that she was a woman of knowledge, not darkness, and that the people would be poorer without her skills. Others, however, whispered that knowledge itself could be dangerous, that it was Eve's thirst for knowledge that had damned mankind in the first place. To them, Prudence's independence was arrogance, her healing was sorcery, and her very existence was a threat to their fragile hold on safety in a hostile land. And so, her story began not with an act of evil, but with suspicion. She was a stranger, an outsider, a woman who did not fit the mold. In a land where conformity meant survival, to stand apart was dangerous. And Prudence Hoffman, whether by choice or fate, stood apart from them all. The first true shadows over Prudence Hoffman's name began with the harvest season of 1835. For months the settlers had labored over their corn, beans, and squash, praying for a yield that would carry them through the winter. Yet when the time came to gather their crops, they found their fields withered. Stalks that should have stood tall and golden bent low, brittle and gray. Beans shriveled in their pods, and squash rotted on the vine. Men and women stood in their fields with hollow eyes, wondering what sin had brought such ruin. It was not long before someone muttered the name of Prudence Hoffman. Whispers spread quickly. One farmer swore that Prudence had walked past his land just days before the blight appeared, her basket heavy with herbs, her eyes fixed on the ground as though she had been muttering a curse. Another claimed that he had seen her drawing water from the river on a moonless night, dipping her hands in as though to poison it. No evidence supported these tales, yet fear seldom required proof. The people only needed a target for their anger, and Prudence was too convenient to ignore. The following month, livestock began to suffer. A cow was found dead in its stall, its tongue blackened, its eyes wide with terror. A farmer in the next valley discovered his flock of chickens slaughtered, their throats slit cleanly, as though by a human hand. He swore that hoofprints unlike any animal he knew surrounded the coop, cloven and deep in the mud. When a neighbor suggested wolves, the farmer shook his head and said the tracks pointed toward Prudence's cabin. Children fell ill soon after. They complained of chills and fevers, of voices whispering to them in the night. Some claimed they saw a figure at the edge of their beds, a woman in dark clothing, her face hidden beneath a bonnet. One girl insisted that she woke to find the figure brushing her hair with icy fingers. When her parents confronted Prudence, she denied ever entering their home. But denial meant little to frightened parents. The girl's story spread, and it became fact in the minds of those who already feared her. The community grew restless. At first, a few brave souls defended Prudence. A mother reminded others of how Prudence had saved her infant's life, while a young man swore that Prudence had healed his festering wound when no one else could. Yet their voices were drowned out by the louder cries of suspicion. The devil blesses before he destroys, the preacher thundered one Sunday morning. Mark my words, her gifts are no gifts at all, but lures to draw us into sin. The congregation nodded, their faces grim, their faith transforming doubt into certainty. Fear crept into every corner of daily life. Neighbors who once helped Prudence gather would now cross the road to avoid her. Children who once followed her for stories now ran from her shadow. When she entered the small trading post in the valley, conversation ceased, and eyes followed her every movement. It did not matter that she bought only flour, salt, and cloth. People whispered that the herbs hidden in her basket were meant for wicked rites. Prudence remained calm in the face of these growing suspicions, but even she could not ignore the hostility. At times she wondered if she should leave, take her oxen and her wagon, and disappear into the wilderness. Yet the Ozarks were no safer than the villagers' suspicion. The woods held dangers of their own, and besides, where would she go? She had chosen this land for its isolation, its silence. To leave would mean beginning again in another place that would likely treat her the same. So she stayed, alone in her cabin at the edge of the forest, watching as fear coiled around her like a snake. It was during the harsh winter of 1836 that the shadows grew darkest. A boy named Samuel, only 10 years old, vanished into the woods one snowy afternoon. His father, frantic with grief, organized a search party that combed the valleys and ridges until their torches burned low. For 2 days the boy was gone, and when they finally found him, he was lying at the base of an old oak tree, shivering but alive. When asked what had happened, Samuel whispered through chattering teeth that a woman had called to him, leading him into the trees. She said she wanted to keep me. The boy confessed, his voice trembling. When asked who the woman was, he buried his face in his father's coat and whispered a single name, Prudence. That was enough. To many, it was the final proof. Whether the boy's imagination had twisted shadows into monsters or whether his fever had confused him, no one cared. The fact that he had spoken Prudence's name sealed her fate in their minds. The whispers grew into accusations, and the accusations into demands. Tension thickened with each passing day. Families gathered in hushed groups, speaking of signs and curses. The preacher's sermons turned darker, his words filled with warnings of God's wrath if they allowed evil to remain among them. "We cannot harbor the devil's handmaid," he declared, sweat dripping from his brow as he pounded his fist on the pulpit. "If we turn our eyes from sin, we invite it into our homes." The division among the settlers deepened. Some still clung to reason, urging caution and reminding the others that Prudence had harmed no one directly. But reason was no match for fear. Fear united people more strongly than logic, and fear demanded an enemy. By the spring thaw, it was clear that the people had chosen their scapegoat. Every cough, every dead lamb, every storm that tore at the roofs of their cabins was laid at Prudence Hoffman's feet. She had become the embodiment of all their dread, a living vessel for the darkness they believed haunted the Ozarks. And though she had done little more than live quietly and offer her knowledge, the shadows around her grew too heavy to ignore. The stage was set. All it would take was one more spark, one more misfortune, to drive the fearful settlers from whispers to action. And in the valleys of the Ozarks, where the line between superstition and truth was as thin as mist, sparks were never far away. By the summer of 1836, fear had ripened into something that could no longer be contained. The settlers had borne another season of strange misfortunes. A barn struck by lightning during a cloudless night, a wagon that overturned and killed a father of 4, and 2 stillborn infants born within the same week. None of these tragedies had any connection to Prudence Hoffman in truth, but by then her name had become the echo that followed every disaster. It was whispered in prayers, muttered in anger, and hissed in the ears of the preacher, until finally the community decided that something had to be done. It began with a gathering at the church, a low log structure that leaned against the wind like an old man weary from standing too long. Men with furrowed brows and women clutching their children sat on rough benches while the preacher thundered about sin and witchcraft. "We have allowed evil to nest among us," he cried, his voice cracking with zeal. "The Lord will not bless a people who turn a blind eye to the devil's work." Heads nodded, voices murmured assent, and eyes turned toward the absent figure of Prudence Hoffman. The idea of a trial arose not from law but from desperation. There were no judges in the Ozarks, no lawyers or courts to turn to. Justice here was whatever the people agreed upon, and the people agreed that Prudence must be judged. A council of sorts was formed: farmers, hunters, and the preacher himself. They decided to hold the trial in the largest cabin in the valley, one with enough space for the settlers to crowd inside and witness what they believed would be the unmasking of a witch. On the appointed evening, Prudence was brought from her cabin by 2 men who had once come to her for medicine. Their faces were grim, their eyes avoiding hers, as though ashamed of what they now must do. She did not resist. Dressed in her plain black dress, her bonnet tied beneath her chin, she walked steadily to the cabin where her fate awaited. If she felt fear, she did not show it. Her calmness unsettled those who saw her, for in their eyes, innocence should have trembled. The cabin was crowded, the air thick with sweat and smoke from the tallow candles that flickered along the walls. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering prayers, while children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. At the front, the preacher stood like a judge, his Bible in hand, his eyes blazing with fervor. Beside him sat 3 men chosen as elders, their faces stern with the weight of responsibility. Prudence was placed on a low stool before them, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unwavering. The accusations came swiftly. One man claimed his cow had sickened after Prudence passed his field. A woman swore her daughter's fever had worsened after Prudence touched her forehead. Another insisted that Prudence's shadow moved differently from her body, stretching longer than it should in the moonlight. Each testimony was met with murmurs of fear and approval, for the people had already decided her guilt before she ever spoke. When asked to defend herself, Prudence's voice was calm, almost weary. She explained her remedies, her herbs, her long nights tending to the sick. She reminded them of the children she had delivered safely, the wounds she had stitched, the fever she had broken. "If I am cursed," she said quietly, "then why would I work so hard to save your lives?" But reason was not what the people wanted. They wanted fear confirmed, darkness named, and their suffering given a shape they could confront. Her words only angered them more. "The devil heals as well as harms," the preacher thundered. "Do not be deceived by her honeyed tongue. She is a wolf among us, cloaked in the guise of a healer." The atmosphere grew heavier as the questioning continued. One man insisted he had seen Prudence in the forest at night, her lantern glowing red as she whispered to unseen figures. Another claimed that when she looked at him, his dreams turned dark for a week. Children were pushed forward to repeat their tales of a woman in black visiting them in the night. Whether these memories were truth, dream, or invention no longer mattered. They were evidence enough in the eyes of the crowd. Then something happened that sealed the mood of the trial forever. As the preacher raised his voice in accusation, one of the candles sputtered and went out. Another followed, then a third, until half the cabin was plunged into shadow. A draft of cold air swept through the room, though no door had opened. A child screamed, and in the flickering half-light Prudence's face appeared eerily still, her eyes catching the candlelight in a way that made them gleam unnaturally. To the fearful, it was a sign. To the believers, it was proof. Cries erupted. "Witch, she curses us even now." The preacher shouted for calm, but his own voice was ragged with terror. Prudence sat unmoving, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Some said later that she smiled in that moment, though others swore she looked only sad. Memory twisted with fear, and the truth was lost. The trial ended not with a verdict, but with a frenzy. The preacher declared that the people could not suffer her presence any longer. "We must cleanse ourselves of this evil," he cried, and the crowd answered with shouts of agreement. Prudence was pulled to her feet, her arms bound with rough rope. She did not fight, though her lips moved silently, as though in prayer or curse. They dragged her from the cabin into the night, the cold stars staring down like indifferent witnesses. The people followed, torches in hand, their faces lit with firelight and fear. Some wept, some shouted, and others remained silent, but all were united in one thing. Prudence Hoffman would not see another dawn in peace. The mob swelled around her, a sea of voices rising against the dark sky. And though Prudence walked with steady steps, the night seemed to pulse with unease, as though the forest itself leaned closer to watch what would come. The trial was over, but the true horror was only just beginning. They led Prudence Hoffman through the darkness like a prisoner of war, her shadow stretching across the uneven ground in the flickering torchlight. The night air was sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the settlers' boots crunched on gravel and broken twigs as they moved in a mass, their torches hissing and spitting sparks. The forest seemed to close in around them, the towering trees swaying though the air was still. To some, it felt as if the woods themselves were watching, waiting. No one had decided what should be done with her, but anger needed no plan. Some shouted for her to be hanged, others demanded she be burned, and still others wanted her cast into the river to see if she would sink or float. The preacher, his voice strained from shouting in the cabin, called out that she must be purged by fire, for only flame could cleanse the devil's mark. The word fire spread quickly through the mob, repeated with growing fervor until it became a chant. Fire! 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 Prudence was dragged toward a clearing where an abandoned hunting cabin leaned against the edge of the woods. The structure had been empty for years, its timbers warped, its roof sagging, and its windows gaping like hollow eyes. It was the perfect place, they decided, to rid themselves of her. They shoved her inside, her hands still bound, her bonnet falling askew. A woman in the crowd spat on the ground, cursing her, while a man slammed the door shut with a finality that echoed like a death knell. Torches were pressed against the dry timbers. At first, the flames licked hesitantly at the wood, small tongues of orange curling and retreating. Then, with a sudden roar, the fire caught, racing up the walls and across the roof. The crackle and pop of burning wood filled the night, mingling with the shouts of the crowd and the cries of children too young to understand what they were witnessing. Inside the cabin, Prudence's figure could be seen through the gaps in the walls, illuminated by the flames. Some said she stood calmly, her eyes lifted toward the heavens, as though in prayer. Others swore she laughed, her voice carrying above the roar of the fire. A few even claimed her shadow grew monstrous, stretching across the walls in shapes no human body could make. Memory, twisted by fear and firelight, gave birth to legends that would endure for generations. The flames grew hotter, sparks leaping into the night sky like a swarm of fireflies. The people stood transfixed, their faces glowing red, their eyes wide. The preacher shouted prayers above the din, urging the Lord to receive their offering and cleanse their land. Yet even as he spoke, unease spread among them. For though the fire raged, there were no screams from within, no desperate cries for mercy, no pounding against the walls. Prudence Hoffman remained silent, and that silence was more terrifying than any shriek could have been. Then, just as the roof began to collapse, a sound split the night. It was not the cry of a woman, nor the crack of timber, but a deep, resonant wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It rolled through the valley, shaking the very ground beneath their feet, and every torch seemed to gutter at once. The settlers froze, their hearts hammering, their voices caught in their throats. Children clung to their mothers, men gripped their rifles, and women covered their ears. The wail lasted only a few moments, but it was enough to brand itself into their memories forever. When it ended, the cabin was collapsing inward, a tower of flame that lit the clearing brighter than day. Sparks rained down, catching in the settlers' hair and clothing, but no one moved to brush them away. All eyes were fixed on the inferno, waiting for some sign, some proof that Prudence Hoffman was gone. At last the roof caved, sending a shower of embers into the sky. The crowd let out a collective breath, a mixture of relief and dread. Some wept, others muttered prayers, and a few shouted victory. Yet even in that moment, a chill passed through them. For though the fire consumed the cabin entirely, no body was ever seen within. Some insisted they saw her shape vanish in the smoke, carried upward into the night sky. Others swore they glimpsed her slipping into the forest shadows, untouched by the flames. The preacher raised his arms, declaring that the land was cleansed, but his voice wavered. In his heart, he could not rid himself of the feeling that something far worse had been unleashed. The people dispersed slowly, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Mothers hurried their children away, fathers carried their torches low, and not one of them dared to look back at the smoldering ruins of the cabin. By dawn, nothing remained of the structure but blackened beams and ash. The ground was scorched, the air heavy with the stench of smoke and char. Yet among the ruins, no bones were found. Searchers sifted through the ash, their hands shaking, but there was nothing, no remains, no trace of Prudence Hoffman at all. The earth seemed to have swallowed her whole. That day, fear transformed into something deeper, something that would never leave the Ozarks. For though they had sought to destroy her, the absence of proof gave rise to a more terrifying belief, that Prudence Hoffman had not died at all, that she had slipped beyond the reach of fire and rope, and that she now walked the woods as something more than human. The settlers did not speak of it openly, not at first. But at night, behind closed doors, the whispers began. Some claimed to hear footsteps outside their cabins, soft and deliberate. Others swore they saw a woman's shape in the mist, her bonnet casting her face in shadow. Livestock balked at the forest edge, refusing to graze, and dogs howled endlessly, their eyes fixed on something unseen. The night of blood and fire had not ended their fear, it had multiplied it. For in trying to rid themselves of Prudence Hoffman, they had only ensured she would never be forgotten. Her story had crossed from flesh into legend, and legends do not burn. The months that followed the burning of the cabin were marked by a silence that hung over the Ozarks like a heavy shroud. The settlers went about their work with lowered eyes, speaking little of what had happened, yet no one could escape the sense that something had changed. The woods felt darker, the nights longer, and the air itself seemed to hum with an unseen presence. Though the preacher declared the land cleansed, few believed it. For in truth, the horror had only just begun. The first signs were subtle. Families reported hearing knocks on their doors at night, but when they opened them, no one stood outside. A woman swore she heard someone whispering her name in the wind, though she was alone in the fields. Livestock refused to enter certain pastures, balking and snorting at shadows. At first, these things were dismissed as nerves or imagination, the lingering effects of what they had done to Prudence Hoffman. But then came the events that no one could ignore. A family of 5 was found gone without a trace. Their cabin door hung open, their hearth still warm, and supper laid out on the table. No footprints marked the ground, no signs of struggle were found. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole. The neighbors whispered that Prudence had taken them, claiming their souls in retribution. Soon after, the river that wound through the valley ran red for 3 days. Some said it was the rust of minerals loosened by spring rains. Others swore it was blood. Children were kept from the water, and prayers were spoken with trembling lips. At night, voices began to echo through the trees. Low, mournful sounds that carried on the wind. Men who went hunting reported hearing footsteps behind them, though no one was there when they turned. One swore he saw a figure dressed in black gliding between the trees, her bonnet hiding her face. Another claimed that as he raised his rifle to shoot a deer, the animal spoke in Prudence's voice, warning him to leave the forest. He dropped his gun and fled, never to hunt again. The people grew certain that a curse lay upon the Ozarks. It was not just Prudence they feared now, but the land itself, as though her spirit had seeped into the soil, the rivers, and the trees. They began to mark their doors with crosses carved into the wood, hung sprigs of cedar and garlic from their windows, and carried charms in their pockets. Yet for all their efforts, misfortune continued. Crops failed again, cabins collapsed without warning, and children wasted away from illnesses no herb or prayer could cure. Some families chose to leave, packing what they could and heading east in hopes of escaping the curse. Yet many remained, bound by poverty or stubbornness, and their fear grew into a way of life. They told their children never to speak Prudence Hoffman's name after dark, for to do so was to invite her shadow. They warned them never to wander too close to the ruins of the burned cabin, where strange lights still flickered at night. And above all, they taught them that the forest was not to be trusted. In the end, Prudence's death had not cleansed the Ozarks, it had stained it. What had been an act of destruction became the seed of a legend, and that legend grew roots that reached deep into the lives of all who remained. Whether she had truly cursed the land, or whether the settlers' own guilt had conjured the horrors they now endured, no one could say. But the result was the same. The Ozarks were no longer just a wilderness. They were haunted, and Prudence Hoffman's presence lingered in every shadow. Decades passed, yet the name Prudence Hoffman was never forgotten. Children born long after the night of fire grew up hearing her story whispered by candlelight. Parents used her as a warning, telling their sons and daughters that if they disobeyed, Prudence would come for them in the night. Stay close to home, mothers cautioned. Don't wander into the woods after dark, or the widow will take you. Fear of her became a tool of discipline, but beneath the warnings lay a genuine terror that lingered from generation to generation. Strange misfortunes continued to strike the valley, always explained as the work of Prudence's spirit. A hunter vanished while tracking deer and was later found lifeless at the base of a cliff, his body twisted as though he had been pushed. A cabin collapsed in the middle of the night, killing a family in their sleep. The survivors swore they heard laughter in the wind. During one long winter, 3 families froze to death even though their fires had been stoked. Their neighbors claimed the flames had turned to ice at her touch. Over time, the ruins of the burned cabin became a place of dread. No one dared to build there, though the land might have been fertile. Children dared each other to approach, but most fled before getting close. On some nights, lights were seen glowing among the blackened timbers, and faint singing carried through the trees. The older settlers said it was Prudence calling, waiting for someone to join her in the ashes. The community carried on, but always under the shadow of her memory. Even when the world changed, when railroads cut through Missouri, when towns grew and the wilderness thinned, the stories of Prudence Hoffman did not fade. If anything, they grew stronger, passed along like heirlooms, embroidered with new details each time. Some said she appeared in dreams. Others swore they saw her standing at the edge of fields, watching silently. Every generation added its own layer to the legend, until the woman who once lived among them became less a memory than a myth. Yet whether myth or truth, her presence was undeniable. The people of the Ozarks never spoke her name without lowering their voices, and never walked the woods at night without glancing over their shoulders. The land itself seemed marked by her, a scar that time could not heal. And so the horrifying case of Prudence Hoffman lived on, not in court records or written accounts, but in the fearful hearts of those who called the Ozarks home. Though the story has reached its end, the echoes of Prudence Hoffman refuse to fade. Even today, storytellers gather around campfires or in quiet taverns deep in Missouri, their voices dropping to a hush when they speak her name. To them, Prudence is not just a ghost, but a mirror of human fear. The fear of the unknown, of the outsider, of truths people cannot control. Her tale reminds listeners of how quickly suspicion can turn into violence, and how guilt can shape legends that last centuries. Modern investigators often debate whether the horrors attributed to her are supernatural or psychological. Some believe the settlers' collective guilt created a haunted atmosphere, passed down through generations until ordinary misfortunes seemed like curses. Others point to the sheer number of consistent accounts, lights, voices, vanishings, as evidence that something lingers in the Hoffman woods. Whatever the explanation, the story serves as a cautionary reminder. Once fear is sown, it grows roots deeper than any tree. The ruins of the cabin still stand, blackened stones half buried in earth and moss. Visitors leave offerings there, coins, flowers, carved charms, unsure whether they are gestures of apology or attempts at protection. Those who linger too long report feelings of being watched, as though the forest itself resents their presence. Locals rarely interfere, quietly respecting the ground as sacred, cursed, or perhaps both. In schools across the Ozarks, children still whisper about Prudence when teachers turn their backs. They dare each other to speak her name 3 times after dark, a game that always ends in nervous laughter and hurried footsteps home. The legend is now woven into the very identity of the region. It is more than a ghost story. It is folklore, history, and a wound that never healed. For the wider world, the case of Prudence Hoffman remains a mystery with no final answer. Was she a healer unjustly condemned? A woman touched by forces beyond human comprehension? Or simply a victim of her time, transformed into a figure of dread by centuries of storytelling? No one can say for certain. But as long as the Ozark woods stand in their shadowed silence, as long as the wind carries whispers through the trees, the horrifying case of Prudence Hoffman will endure, half history, half nightmare, wholly unforgettable. 1.